Hi, I'm Kat, and today I have a word in Romanian for you, and also we are talking about another true crime case. So let's start with the word. The word in Romanian is mulțumesc. 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 Well done, guys. You just said thank you. Today we are talking about the case of Leiland-James Corkill, and it really surprises me that this case has barely any coverage out there, especially considering the circumstances surrounding Leiland-James's death. Leiland-James was in the care of Cumbria Council, living with his soon-to-be adoptive family, but tragically, baby Leiland-James was murdered at the hands of his foster carer. He was removed from his biological mother 48 hours after he was born and placed in the care of potential adopters, where sadly, at 1 year old, he was brutally murdered at the hands of his foster mother. So let's just, find out all of the details about this. Before I get started, a quick disclaimer: I don't mean any disrespect to anyone I talk about in the video. This is for educational purposes only. All the information I'm giving you is already found in the public domain, and I will also be sharing my own views and opinions around the case I'm talking about. Thank you so much. Laura Corkill was prepared for the birth of her son. The baby's room was newly decorated. She even had folded clothing in the drawers. She had even chosen the name. Leiland-James Micheal Corkill was born by emergency C-section 4 days before Christmas at West Cumberland Hospital in Whitehaven, UK on 21st of December 2019. Mom and baby bonded straight away, and it was just perfect. Leiland-James was a happy baby with a huge smile, big bright eyes and chubby cheeks. He was full of joy, and Laura couldn't wait to bring her new baby home. Leiland-James had 4 older siblings: 21-year-old Lewis, 13-year-old Aurora, 9-year-old Summer-Rose Sapphire, and 8-year-old Felicia-Crystal Destiny. I have to say, guys, that these are some really beautiful names. I really love them. But 48 hours after Leiland-James was born, he was taken away from Laura. The midwife who helped deliver him came to tell Laura there was a social worker at his cot, just about to remove him. Laura went and confronted the social worker, but she was told that paperwork had been sent to her solicitor. However, Laura still didn't see any paperwork. Her world shattered when her son was carried away from her. It was 2019, and over the following year she would try to get Leiland-James back, but sadly she would never be able to. When Laura fell pregnant with Leiland-James, she was in a really good place. She was being supported by Aisha Dreiser from Women Out West, an organization helping women who have suffered domestic and violence. Laura already knew what it was like to have a child removed by social services. A few years earlier, she was a victim of the. She asked for help to remove her partner from her home, but weeks after doing this, her children were taken away instead. Fast forward, she fell pregnant with James, and that's when she wanted to do everything possible to make sure that social services won't take Leiland-James away from her. And she was really excited. She was over the moon. The weeks went by into her pregnancy, and she hadn't heard anything from social services until she was 22 weeks pregnant. The first social worker who saw her seemed to be quite happy with the preparation made for the baby at home. She checked everything around the house, and there were no issues. The social worker saw from Laura's previous paperwork that she has come a long way. But obviously Laura wanted to make sure everything was fine, and so she asked the social worker if she would be able to keep her baby. The social worker reassured there was no reason whatsoever for the baby to be taken into care. Laura even got the cot ready. She even decorated his room in blue and white. And you would think that this would be the end of it, right? We got to the end of the video and finally we have a happy ending. But no, you would be mistaken. A second social worker replaced the first one, and Laura said everything changed with the second social worker. She wanted to know more about Laura's past, in particular her time with the partner when her first 2 children were taken away from her. Laura was completely honest and open about everything. She passed several parenting assessment courses and she was determined to carry on, and she truly believed that her new baby won't be taken away from her. Cumbria County Council, however, had a different story and said that in the last month of Laura's pregnancy, the plan was to remove her son at birth. They even said they told her that 3 times. Laura disagrees with this. After Leiland-James was taken away from the hospital, she still didn't see any paperwork, and she only received confirmation when the social worker was taking her son from the hospital. So let's see, who do we believe here? Let's weigh the probabilities. Do we believe social services, who more often than not lie to cover their bums? Or do we believe Laura, who did everything right to make sure she can have her baby after she was a victim of DV and her other 2 children were taken away when she asked for help? I don't know who do you believe, but honestly I tend to believe Laura, so you let me know of your opinion in the comment section below. A few years earlier, Laura was a victim of DV. She asked for help to remove the partner from her home. Clearly, she wasn't feeling safe with him and she was looking to protect her children, so she did the right thing then. And a few weeks later, her children are being removed. A few years later, she gets pregnant with Leiland-James, not with the same partner. She changed everything. She was working with social services. She did everything it was asked of her. She passed the assessments. So clearly she learned a lesson, right? She wanted to make sure that she doesn't lose another baby. Only for this to be in vain, because 48 hours after Leiland-James's birth, he was taken away. Laura lost Leiland-James forever that day. Laura's home is on the edge of Whitehaven, in a corner of an estate looking down on the town's harbour. Fun fact, I'm gonna jump in here with a fun fact. Whitehaven is a Georgian town on the northwest Cumbrian coast near the Lake District National Park in England, which originated in 1633 as a small fishing village, developing into the 3rd largest trading port in the UK, exporting coal worldwide. The harbour was also home to an important shipbuilding industry with over 1,000 vessels being built. Going back to our story, Aisha from Women Out West and her colleague Rebecca Todd, who are experienced in helping women who have suffered domestic violence, and they were working with Laura, had no idea either that Leiland-James was going to be taken. They found out only when Laura called them from the ward at the hospital. Naturally, they were devastated as well. Whatever the plan was, nobody told them anything. Aisha had her own plan, which would have seen Laura supported at home with the baby. After Leiland-James was taken away, there were several attempts to negotiate with Cumbria County Council to bring Leiland-James home. Initially, Leiland-James was placed with a temporary foster carer, and he seemed quite happy in the home, but Laura never stopped asking for him back. The BBC has seen evidence that the Women Out West team supporting Laura offered social workers proposals to bring Leiland-James home. Both Aisha and Rebecca say that they were not even listened to. The council told them that Laura was assessed as not being able to meet Leiland-James's needs, and during his life her circumstances didn't change. This is strongly denied by Laura and Women Out West. According to Laura, Aisha and Rebecca, decisions were made based on Laura's past, a belief the violence she faced previously could happen again, putting her and the baby at risk. Laura suffered several miscarriages after experiencing severe violence at the hands of a previous partner. After one of these miscarriages, as she was in a hospital bed recovering from a blood transfusion, her 2 children were removed from the family home. At the time, she reached out to Cumbria County Council for help, but she didn't receive what she needed. Because of her children being taken away, she suffered a mental health breakdown. She collapsed and she ended up in hospital again. For the following years, she felt that she didn't really want to be around anymore. Whilst pregnant with Leiland-James, she wasn't in a relationship and she was in a positive frame of mind. After Leiland-James was removed from Laura, he lived happily with his foster mom, Charlotte Day, enjoying cuddles and stories and playing in his jumperoo bouncer. He went into Charlotte's care only at 2 days old, and she said that he was such a beautiful little boy with a contagious laugh. During the trial, Leiland-James's foster mother, Charlotte Day, who had looked after him since he was removed from his mother at birth, explained Leiland-James had already undergone surgery for gastric issues and had a milk intolerance and liked to be carried. However, he was settled and happy in her home. For the first few months of Leiland-James's life, Laura was able to see him at a council-run contact center. Laura would see her son 4 times a week for an hour and a half a day, but all this time, Laura was expecting Leiland-James to return home. The contact meant the world to Laura, and she even asked to extend it to 2 hours, but they wouldn't do it. Of course they wouldn't. She didn't trust the social workers, but she was willing to cooperate so she could get Leiland-James back. Unfortunately, though, COVID cut off contact. In March 2020, as the country went into its first lockdown, Laura had to take 2 buses, an hour's journey, and turned up at the center only to find that it was closed. For the next 3 months, she asked for video contact, but when she did get it, it just wasn't the same, you know. Laura wanted to hold her son. In July, Laura was told by the family court that Leiland-James would be placed for adoption. Laura wasn't even told that Cumbria County Council already identified her son for adoption, and months earlier they already found a family to place him with. However, Cumbria County Council says they told Laura in April that Leiland-James should be adopted. But you see, it's not like Cumbria County Council is disputing having informed Laura, just like the first time. They say they told her he should be adopted. It's like leaving Laura to kind of, you know, read between the lines, but they are not exactly straightforward, kind of like you reach your own conclusion, but I'm not gonna tell you if it's black or white. You know what I mean? So that they don't get their finger pointed at them if anything goes wrong or if there is a following investigation or review or whatever. The time that Laura had with Leiland-James in the contact center should have indicated that she was clearly able to look after her son. Laura thinks that too much weight was placed on her past and the assumption the baby would be at risk of future emotional harm. Laura also believes that her lack of face-to-face contact with her son because of COVID and the closure of the center was used against her. And yes, I'm going to say I very much agree with that. From personal experience, they would use anything and everything against you. They would turn a positive into a negative to just fit their narrative. In July 2020, the family court ruled Leiland-James was to be adopted, and Laura and Scott Castle were a suitable match. On 22nd of August 2020, Leiland-James was formally placed with the foster mother, Laura Castle, with a view to adoption. So from now on, it might get a bit confusing with the names. Laura Corkill is the biological mom of Leiland-James and Laura Castle is the adoptive mom. So I'll just use their full names instead so it doesn't get confusing. Laura Corkill was supposed to meet Laura Castle as she still had parental rights before the formal adoption took place. But the meeting time was constantly changed. What a surprise there, right? She was given excuse after excuse after excuse by social workers. Either that Leiland-James was poorly when actually he wasn't, or that they had to work. Something always came up. Cumbria County Council, however, says it did plan for a meeting before the adoption order was granted, but everyone involved needed to be emotionally ready, and the pandemic also caused difficulties. I mean, I don't know how emotionally ready a biological parent can be when their child is being adopted without them having a choice or a say in the matter. So I don't know, like I said, excuse after excuse, justification on justification, because that's how the system works, right? Laura Corkill became suspicious after all of these reasons being given to her. She believed something was seriously wrong. She instantly thought that Leiland-James was being used. That's a mother's instinct, you know. Leiland-James was described by those who knew him as an alert and inquisitive child who was beginning to explore his environment. 38-year-old Laura Castle and 35-year-old James Castle lived on Exdale Avenue in Barrow-in-Furness with their biological daughter, who is of school age. Laura Castle was a former care worker, and her husband Scott worked as a machinist at defense firm BAE Systems, doing night shifts. BAE actually manufactures jets for the defense in the UK, so it's an arms, security and aerospace company. Laura and Scott Castle's daughter was born through IVF, and they wanted another child to complete the family, but because of financial and emotional strain and reasons, they didn't want to go through another round of IVF, so they decided they would look into adopting a child. So in January 2019, they both decided to inquire about adoption. Social worker Penny Hindle was assigned to the case and visited the couple for an initial meeting. On March 12, the couple submitted a formal adoption application to Cumbria County Council. The following day, they were accepted for stage 1 of the adoption assessment, which involved mandatory checks such as DBS, Disclosure and Barring Service, or also known as police checks, confidential references, financial assessments, and health and safety checks. They also took part in 3 days of training, a preparation to adopt course provided by the adoption team. They had also completed an individual workbook about themselves. Penny was happy to support the application following the stage 1 assessment. She found the home conditions child-friendly, there were always lots of toys in the house, and both parents were very positive and proactive throughout the process, despite some concern that Laura Castle admitted drinking 2 bottles of wine a week, which was considered to be excessive. At the time of the assessment, some issues emerged in relation to how much alcohol the couple drank. Their drinking was above the healthy recommended limit. Laura Castle stated on her form that she drank 2 bottles of wine a week, and Scott stated that he drank around 10 cans of cider a week. Both wrote on and off on the handwritten forms. The assessing social worker undertook a further exploration of the couple's drinking and evidence of the challenge, and additional assessment was then included. This was acceptable to the adoption panel, who approved them, and later the match. The social worker concluded that the couple had a healthy and informed approach to alcohol. Yes. Stage 1 of the adoption was successfully completed on 17th of May 2019. However, information which Laura Castle had shared with First Step, the service providing her therapy at the time, shows that she was drinking significantly more than this, but it was not known by any other agency at the time. Laura Castle had also disclosed a physical health issue and said that this was managed with medication. This was confirmed by her GP during the assessment. As the condition can be painful, this was discussed with her, as living with pain is a vulnerability that professionals working with Leiland-James and with his prospective adopters needed to be aware of and also consider. Stage 2 of the adoption process began on May 24th, 2019. This was a more in-depth assessment involving 9 separate visits to their home by Penny, the social worker. An undertaking an adoption assessment was carried out in line with national regulations through a mixture of individual and couple assessments. A prospective adopter's report was prepared and signed by Laura and Scott Castle, in which they agreed to use a therapeutic style of parenting and said they didn't agree with physical discipline, among other expectations. Laura and Scott were always punctual and well prepared. They checked and signed the report when completed by Penny as an accurate record before it was submitted to the adoption panel. On September 18, 2019, the adoption application went before the adoption panel. This is a legally authorized panel chaired independently of Cumbria County Council. It consisted of independent members with a background in adoption, along with members who are employed by Cumbria County Council. Medical and legal advisors are available to the panel but don't necessarily attend the hearing in person. A panel advisor, a qualified social worker who has achieved the managerial grade, was was also present to advise on adoption regulations. The panel assessed the vulnerabilities and strengths of the Castle family and examined the prospective adopters' report. The application was successful. The panel referred the Castle's case to the independent agency decision maker, and on September 24, 2019, they were approved to adopt one child aged up to 12 months. On April 9, 2020, Charlotte Day and her partner, who cared for Leiland-James since he was born, were informed that Leiland-James was being considered for adoption. A few weeks later, on May 6, 2020, they were told that a family, the Castles, had been identified as a potential match. The Castles were first informed of the potential match on July 13. Discussions continued throughout mid-July between Penny and the Castles about Leiland-James's possible placement. His needs and post-adoption plan were discussed. On 22nd of July 2020, the placement order was made. On July 24, 2020, a chemistry meeting took place between the Castles and Leiland-James, with Charlotte Day also present. The Castles also had a consultation with a medical advisor who explained Leiland-James had a possible milk intolerance and a 50% chance of ADHD. He had also undergone gastric surgery. The Castles seemed very positive and they wished to proceed. On July 27, 2020, a pre-panel meeting took place at which all reports were discussed and no concerns were raised. Before the case was presented to the panel, Penny had conversations with the Castle family members, both sets of grandparents and a family friend called Claire Shaw, to identify how the Castles could be supported in their care of Leiland-James. Laura and Scott seemed a united couple with a strong and solid relationship. This was confirmed by those friends and family members who provided references. The references included questions about the parents' relationship with their birth child and specifically asked if they were aware if Laura and Scott Castle used smacking, physical punishment, or inappropriate discipline. Everything was positive and nothing of concern was shared. It was seen as a benefit that the couple had close family and friends living nearby who categorically stated that they would support a placement. On 12th of August 2020, the case was presented to Cumbria's adoption panel, which recommended the match. Cumbria County Council's adoptions agency division maker, Senior Manager Deborah Evans, made the decision the following day that Leiland-James should be placed with Laura and Scott Castle. The handover process took place between 14th to 21st of August, with a number of visits at Leiland-James's foster home, then at the Castle's home. The formal handover was on Saturday, 22nd of August 2020. At this point, Leiland-James was 7 months old. As Leiland-James was a looked-after child placed with prospective adopters, mandatory childcare visits initially took place every week until the first looked-after children's review on 1st of October 2020. On Thursday, 27th of August 2020, a visit was carried out by Penny, who observed that Leiland-James was unsettled, as he had been since the handover. Between 3rd of September and 23rd of October 2020, Laura and Scott Castle were offered support from the Strengthening Families team. During a visit on Friday, September 18, Penny noticed that Leiland-James was happy and appeared more settled. Laura Castle engaged well with him and he didn't cry as much. On Thursday, November the 12th, 2020, Laura Castle told Beth Taylor she didn't love Leiland-James during a mandatory visit. Beth reported these comments to Penny, who contacted her manager, Jane Gray, the same day for advice. The manager suggested that it was not unusual for adopters not to feel an instant connection. She advised Penny to consult the advanced practitioner on her team, Juan Arriaga Riera, who suggested reassurance first and then therapeutic support. On Wednesday, 25th of November, Penny called Laura Castle regarding Beth's visit. Laura Castle had told Beth that Leiland-James didn't like standing, he's lazy and he's big. She also said that they feel as they are babysitting him and have to keep him as everyone else, the wider family, loves him. The following day, a supervisory session took place with Penny. Attachment issues were discussed and it was agreed that Penny would undertake a joint visit with Jean Sadler to consider support for the family. On Wednesday, 2nd of December 2020, a child looked after review took place. The prospect of an application for an adoption order, the final stage of the adoption process, was discussed, and it was agreed that given the issues with attachment, the local authority would not recommend an adoption or support an application. Penny explained to Laura and Scott Castle that she wouldn't support an application from them to permanently adopt Leiland-James until further therapeutic work had been done. They said they understood and accepted the decision. On the same day, Julie Gray called Laura Castle, who told Julie that her mom, Julie Houghton, would no longer have Leiland-James. Before the placement, Laura Castle's mother, Julie, had been identified as her most significant source of support. A further visit took place on Wednesday, 16th of December 2020. The Castles were receptive to offers of support, but they explained that Leiland-James was challenging and that Laura Castle struggled to bond with him. However, Laura Castle said that Leiland-James wasn't going anywhere because their extended family were very fond of him and they loved him. Leiland-James's placement with Laura and Scott Castle was discussed on Wednesday 30th and Thursday 31st of December. A care planning meeting was considered to discuss the placement. Sadly, in the morning of January the 6th in 2021, Leiland-James suffered catastrophic head injuries at the family's home in Borough-in-Furness. Laura Castle contacted emergency services and claimed that Leiland-James fell off the sofa, injured his head and was struggling to breathe. The baby was taken to Alderhay Children's Hospital but never regained consciousness. However, the extent of his injuries didn't match Laura Castle's account and hospital staff raised the alarm. Laura Castle lied to police as well as family and friends and said the death was a tragic accident while her husband was asleep. Leiland-James was kept on life support for his birth mother to say her last goodbyes. A social worker phoned Laura Corkill, Leiland-James's biological mother, but the social worker wouldn't tell her which hospital Leiland-James was in. She was up and down all night trying to figure out if she could go to every hospital and find him. The following day, she was told Leiland-James had been moved to Alderhay Children's Hospital in Liverpool. Cumbria County Council says only limited details were shared with Laura because his prospective adoptive parents were with him and the extent of the injuries were not known at the time. But when it became clear he wasn't expected to leave, they rang Laura within an hour. A taxi sent by the council was meant to take Laura Corkill to Liverpool, but Laura said it didn't arrive and her support workers at Women Out West provided transport. Laura Corkill was alone at the hospital when she arrived on 7th of January 2021. By the time she got to his room, Leiland-James had died. By then, her son's body was evidence, a crime scene, and hospital staff wouldn't let her touch him. That's when she knew that his death was not an accident and whoever had him killed him. The surgeon told her they've had suspicions and an investigation was started as soon as Leiland-James went into the hospital. Dr. Joe McPartland, a pediatric pathologist at Alderhay Children's Hospital who examined Leiland-James's eyes, said the constellation of injuries she found were characteristic features of explosive head trauma, also known as the shaken baby syndrome. The severity of the force needed to cause such injuries would be comparable to those caused in high-speed car crashes, falls from several stories, or a severe crushing of the head. The force needed would be well beyond normal handling or the course of rough play, and it would be clearly obvious to an adult that such force would cause injury to the child. She also said that a low-level fall, such as that described by Laura Castle, would be very unlikely to cause the eye injuries. The injuries would have been caused between 24 to 48 hours before his death, which would tie in with them happening shortly before Laura Castle called 999 at about 8:15 a.m. on 6th of January.
Wiped his face, sat him on my knee here, sort of straddled, and she won't go to the toilet without the light on, so she's saying, Mummy, I can't do it myself. So I'm trying to put the wipes back in the coffee table drawer, so I'm leaning over. And then I didn't have hold of him, and I just stood up like that. I went right foot at him, and he fell on the floor.
You said, I would never hurt the children, but only at that time, on the 6th of January, you admitted that you had previously slapped or tapped Leiland-James. You shake your head. Right. Laura also disclosed that she'd smashed his bottom. Both of those things you previously admitted to us. Goes on to say that during the adoption process, both Laura and Scott made it clear they didn't agree with physical chastisement and signed a document, which was the document that we referred to earlier on, confirming they would not physically chastise the children. How do you account for that? How do you account for telling a social worker and signing a document to say you will not physically chastise the children and completely disregard it, and then physically chastise the children because of lying and being needy? Do you accept that you have lied to both your mother and your aunt when you told them that you had made these disclosures when you hadn't?
Pathologist Dr. Alison Armour, who carried out the post-mortem examination, identified a number of bruises and marks on Leiland-James's face, head and body, including one on his cheek, indicative of a slap, others on his forehead consistent with being prodded or poked, and another on his ear, which was most likely caused by pinching or twisting with significant force. A black bruise on his lip and very unusual injury to the back of his throat could have been caused by the forcible insertion of a spoon or feeding bottle, while bruises on his arms were consistent with being gripped. An internal bruise at the back of the head and neck was consistent with an impact site, while one on the top of his scalp would be difficult to explain as the result of a fall, concluding that Leiland-James suffered a serious and severe head injury and blunt impact trauma. The combination of injuries was inconsistent with Leiland-James falling from a sofa, and all but one, a yellow bruise on his chin, were caused at around the same time on 6th of January, with considerable force needed to have been used. At the time of his death, Leiland-James was in the care of the local authority and was placed with the prospective adopters. He had been living with the couple for 5 months before his death. Leiland-James was showing signs of a close relationship with Laura Castle's biological daughter, and his eyes would light up when they came home from school and they would play happily together. Following Leiland-James's death, actions were taken to safeguard the girl. The older child was spoken to by police officers as a potential witness and disclosed the use of physical punishments by her parents on both children. Other witnesses in the police investigation stated that the children were often shouted at, and family members were aware that Laura and Scott Castle used smacking as a punishment, although this wasn't shared with professionals at any time prior to Leiland-James's death. During her assessment to adopt, Laura Castle had said that she suffered with low mood and anxiety in the past, initially linked to her infertility and then due to her reported tendency to overthink and worry. Her GP was involved in the assessment of the adopters and stated at the time that there was no reason or medical conditions that may affect her ability to care for a child. After a review on how the placement and adoption process was handled, it's now known that Laura Castle had historically suffered with juvenile arthritis, which was not shared on the health form and not identified later, as the GP recorded nil in the musculoskeletal system section of the form needed to fill. So apparently this was unknown by the assessing social worker or the adoption panel medical advisor. The review found that in this case the GP didn't appear to have thoroughly considered the medical records to ensure that they provided independent verification of what the patient reported about their medical history. This was due to not all the information having been received and recorded and the time limited available for the GP to thoroughly complete the medical assessment, leading to a potential risk in the system that important information will be missed. The review also found that there is a common feeling among GPs and most professionals that prospective adopters are likely to be open and honest about their past and current medical issues, and that when there is an older child in the family and no known concerns, this potentially also gives false reassurance. The view of the family GP is significant in the adoption assessment as they are specifically asked to comment on health and lifestyle issues which may impact on the applicant's ability to care for a child. In this case, the GP had written on Laura Castle's form that there were no reasons or medical conditions that may affect her ability to care for a child. In this case, this was a significant issue as Laura Castle was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis in September 2020, weeks after Leiland-James's placement with them. Those working with Leiland-James or with her in respect of the adoption were not aware that she had been unwell or of the diagnosis. It was not disclosed by the family and the GP didn't share any information. There was no indication at any visit that Laura Castle was unwell or in pain. This new information was particularly significant as a concern had been raised by the consultant in his letter to the GP regarding Laura Castle's alcohol consumption. The GP told the review that they were not formally informed that the child had been placed with the family and that they only knew because the family registered Leiland-James at the surgery. But strengthening families dispute this. They told the review that they informed the GP surgery that Leiland-James was a child in care, placed for adoption, and provided information, including the contact details for the allocated social worker. Social workers also had a record of this notification to the GP, which was placed onto Leiland-James's electronic case file. It's also now known that Laura Castle was struggling with her mental health around the start of the adoption assessment. An initial visit form was completed by the assessing adoption social worker at their first visit to the couple in January 2019. Nothing was disclosed by Laura and Scott Castle during the first meeting. When the medical form was completed, it emerged that Laura Castle had spoken to her GP about anxiety and low mood in 2011 and 2018, apparently linked to her infertility both before and after she had her child. The matter of not disclosing this information was later addressed with her, who stated that she felt that the question at the initial visit only related to whether she was experiencing current medical health difficulties, so she answered in the negative. The adoption social worker and her supervisor told the review that it's not uncommon for applicants to fail to disclose all information at the initial visit, and that if there were no other attempts to cover up this information or to avoid talking about it, they were not concerned. This was therefore not viewed as a lack of potential openness and honesty. Laura Castle presented her mental health issues as historic, and no indication was given that they were as recent as it's now known they were. The criminal investigation into Leiland-James's death identified that Laura Castle was receiving talking therapy support from First Step at the time of the adoption assessment. This information wasn't known to the assessing social worker and was not shared by the GP in the adoption medical report, other than a sentence that she had reported anxiety and depression and received counseling in 2011 and 2018, and which had settled on its own. First Step informed the GP of their involvement in the early months of 2019, but didn't include any details regarding what was discussed with Laura Castle. During the review, First Step confirmed that they had worked with her from December 2018 to April 2019. The couple's application to be assessed as adopters was made in January 2019. So this ongoing work was relevant to the assessment. The adoption team didn't request permission to make checks with First Step, as they had been under the impression from the adopters and from the GP information that the involvement was historic and related to Laura Castle's feelings about the couple's infertility, but this was not the case. The information held by First Step shows that she had issues with her low mood, anxiety, and anger management. This included her self-report that she was often irritable and short-tempered, including shouting too much at her young child. She spoke about feeling judged by other parents and that she avoided company. She also reported drinking six bottles of wine a week, 6 bottles, not 2, which impacted on her motivation and mood, although she denied it had an impact on her parenting. The initial assessment by First Step was completed and it was agreed that talking therapy was required. The assessment was a telephone appointment and the treatment appointments were face-to-face. At Laura Castle's request, the focus of the work was on her anxiety and mood. No consideration was given to the impact on a young child of her reported issues, and no safeguarding or clinical supervision was requested by the assessing mental health worker, and the information shared by the mother was not considered through a safeguarding lens. First Step were not aware that the couple applied to adopt a child and that an assessment was being completed. They did share with the GP that they were working with her, although no detail of what was discussed with her was included. In April 2019, the work with First Step stopped at her request, and again the GP was informed. This correspondence was not reflected in the GP information shared during the adoption medical assessment and was not shared with or requested by Children's Social Care. So, as you can already tell by now, there's the lack of communication here between different agencies. Information is not being shared, information is not being passed on, and information is also not being requested. I still feel that social services played a big part in this. As part of the adoption process, medical advice and professionals were available within the organization, but their services were not exactly used. The GP was given a short time to complete the assessment, and also the GP failed to inform social services of everything that was happening. First Step failed to inform social services about the risks to the older child in the family with Laura Castle's mood and anger management issue. First Step is a mandated reporter, so they should have flagged this to social services. It's a failure, I think, of all of these agencies together. Scott Castle was also spoken to about his wife's mental health by the assessing adoption social worker, and it was stated that he presented as a supportive and understanding partner, who was clear that he balanced his wife's reported tendency to worry and overthink things. The fact that Laura Castle reported that her GP was supportive was seen as a positive support and safety factor, as was her reported good experience of talking therapy in the past. Once the placement was underway, her social worker continued to speak to her about how she was feeling. There was no indication that any of the symptoms reported to First Step early in 2019 were an issue, but as those involved were not aware, they were not specifically discussed. And I feel like there's just too much trust given to Laura Castle by the social worker. Assumptions are being made. She's seen as a positive support when she reports about her having therapy in the past without this being followed on, because if they would have found out that Laura Castle had anger management issues as well, which played a huge part in Leiland-James's murder. Following Leiland-James's placement, Laura Castle had further health concerns. She was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and during the process of diagnosis, she was referred to a consultant gastroenterologist. Yes, I knew I'm not going to be able to pronounce this. So she was referred to a consultant gastroenterologist by the GP and seen in September 2020, around a month after Leiland-James was placed, for a separate health condition. During this consultation, a concern was raised with her about her alcohol intake by the consultant gastroenterologist, which at that stage was 27 units a week and was believed to be having an impact on her health condition. This information was shared with the GP in a letter, but neither the health issue or the alcohol use was shared with any other agency. According to the NHS, men and women are advised not to drink more than 14 units a week on a regular basis. This was not considered in respect of the potential impact on Leiland-James or the older child. Laura and Scott Castle didn't disclose these new health issues to their own social worker or Leiland-James's social worker. The assessment of the couple also includes a financial assessment. They were asked to complete a finance form and to provide bank statements and other financial documents to corroborate their information. It was found out after Leiland-James's death that the family had significant loans and credit card debt without having the income to service this debt. The unclear form they filled in allowed the family to disguise what they owed and that they were only paying the minimum amount each month, leading to the debt increasing. A placement order had been agreed by the court in July 2020. Leiland-James was effectively free to be placed for adoption. Several meetings were held to consider the potential match with these adopters in the month that followed, and the required reports were written. The adoption panel that considered the match was held in August 2020 as an additional panel. This was a timely response to ensure that the proposed plan of introductions could start and Leiland-James could be with the family prior to his new sibling starting school. There was a gap of almost 1 year between the family being approved and them being matched with Leiland-James and him moving to their care. During this time, they attended courses and a support group where they met other prospective adopters, some of whom they then had informal contact with outside of the group. They also had contact with their adoption social worker monthly and received a regular adoption newsletter with relevant updates. Along with all prospective adopters in Cumbria, they were offered membership to a site for therapeutic support. And this almost 1 year between them being agreed as potential adopters and Leiland-James moving into their care is very interesting, and I think that this plays a huge part in what happened, because it seems that usually the placement process would take 1 year in total, which would mean that the assessments would have to be revisited in the sense that they would have to be renewed, so the check would be made again. This includes police checks, medical checks, financial checks, and so on, you get it. But in this case, the process took 11 months. 1 month short of 1 year, because apparently everybody wanted Leiland-James to move in before Laura and Scott's daughter was starting school, which kind of seems like, to me at least, that this was being pushed before the 1 year is ending so that social services don't have to go through all these assessments again, saving time, resources, money or whatever. And also, having consulted with a solicitor myself, children over the age of 1 year old, as sad as it sounds, they are harder to get adopted because usually parents want a baby so they can raise the baby as their own and bond with them, form a relationship and all these kind of things. So I feel like this is another thing that social services were trying to push, because they probably knew that time is going to be up very soon for Leiland-James and he won't be as desirable for adoption. As horrible as it sounds. And I do apologize, it sounds horrible, but unfortunately this is the hard truth. I know it's a hard pill to swallow, but it's how it works. After the potential match was identified, Laura and Scott Castle were given information about Leiland-James and his wider family history. This included consideration of the issues they may face in the future. They had a consultation with the community pediatrician, who is the medical advisor to the adoption panel when the match was being considered. This is an important meeting for all adopters, as they are provided with medical information about the child and their parents or siblings, and is an opportunity to know what may lie ahead. In this case, the couple appeared to understand what health needs Leiland-James may have, and they weren't overly concerned. A chemistry meeting between Leiland-James and the couple was held in July 2020 at the foster carer's home, which was positive. The plan made for the introductions included a combination of time spent at the foster care placement, outside of the placement, at the adopter's home, and with the older birth child. Sessions were observed by the social worker for the child. Scott had time off from work on adoption leave when Leiland-James moved into his home. He had recently returned to work after a period of furlough and worked on permanent nights. The couple later reflected that they wished the introductions included more time spent at their home to ease the transition for Leiland-James, although at the time they were incredibly positive and voicing their wish for him to move to their home as soon as possible. The newly allocated social worker for Leiland-James visited him in his prospective adoptive placement within 3 weeks of him being placed, having telephoned the week before. During Leiland-James's matching process, there had been careful consideration given to the impact on the birth child and awareness that they would be starting school around the time of the placement. This was taken into consideration for the introductions and the plan for when Leiland-James should move in. At the time of the adoption assessment, the adoption social worker spent time with the birth child as part of this assessment, and they were able to talk about what they like doing, showing the social worker their bedroom and toys. This was felt to be age appropriate at the time. By the time the match was proposed, the child was around 18 months older. Following Leiland-James's death, the sibling was able to give a very clear account to police officers and social workers about what was happening at home. After Leiland-James went to live in his new home, small but significant concerns began to emerge. The older child had a pre-arranged operation which was not disclosed to the local authority. The family also appeared to be calling Leiland-James by his middle name, despite them agreeing they would not do so. Then, against clear advice and unknown to the social workers, it was shared that Leiland-James was spending significant amounts of time, including overnight stays, alone with his soon-to-be adoptive grandparents and aunt and uncle. The experienced staff involved acknowledged that Leiland-James's placement was vulnerable to breakdown and that there was likely to be an impact on his attachment to his new parents. However, those involved with Leiland-James recognized the signs and were concerned that the information emerging was an indication that the placement was at risk of breaking down, and they planned to increase support to the family. The head teacher at the older child's school was told by the local authority that the family were hoping to adopt and provided a reference, both in writing and verbally, as part of the assessment. The school was not updated at the time the match was made. The family informed their social worker that they informed the school themselves, but this was not the case. The school may have been well placed to support the birth child at the time of the placement. They told the review that, with hindsight, they believe the placement possibly had an impact on the adoptive siblings' behavior at school, as they presented as emotional and very needy at this time. The older child's planned operation in November 2020 involved the family having to isolate at home for a week and the older child missing school for 2 weeks. Afterwards, the older child needed extra care and attention from the parents and was particularly clingy to their mother, struggling with Leiland-James getting attention. This was at the time that Leiland-James was particularly in need of developing a close relationship with his adopters, and this dynamic would have added to the family stress. Laura and Scott Castle didn't inform either their own social worker or Leiland-James's social worker, so there was no opportunity to consider the impact on Leiland-James of this period of isolation and the birth child's reaction to the operation. There was a degree of anxiety shared by the couple at the time of matching about the name given to Leiland-James when he was born, which was distinctive and spelled unusually. They asked if they could just use James instead. This wasn't agreed, as it's good practice to ensure a child retains their birth name to assist them in the transition, as it is the name that they are used to, and later when there is a need to understand their identity. A lot of work was undertaken with the couple about the need for him to retain his birth name, including being clear that if they didn't like or accept the name, they shouldn't progress with the match. The social worker for Leiland-James and the adopter's social worker later found out that he was being referred to by James, by the older child and other family members. This was denied by the couple, but there was a suspicion that it was their intention to call him James going forward, despite advice to the contrary. The school was able to confirm during the review that Leiland-James was known to them as James, including on a preschool application. This shows a degree of disguised compliance by the adopters, where they agreed with what the professional said in meetings but did not comply with this advice. Despite advice to the contrary, it emerged in December 2020 that Leiland-James had been cared for by extended family members, including overnight stays on around 4 occasions. The first 6 months of an adoption placement are crucial to the child attaching to their new parents, and there is an expectation that this time is invested in the child by their immediate carers. While wider family members are crucial in supporting the placement, the early months need to focus on the child being part of the nuclear family. When discussing concerns about how the placement was going, the couple shared that they had been feeling let down by some family members who are not supporting them as much as promised. When Leiland-James was placed in August 2020, there had been some issues with feeding and reflux. He had been on a milk ladder at the foster carers, and this was transferred with him when he was placed for adoption. Leiland-James was slightly overweight and didn't progress with his expected mobility. This was believed to be in large part due to him being carried a lot in the previous foster care placement. It was acknowledged that there were 2 carers and several much older children in the placement, and that they tended to hold Leiland-James a lot, particularly when they were all at home during the lockdown. As well as having an impact on his mobility, this meant he was not always easy to settle by Laura and Scott Castle, who were unable to hold him as much as he had been used to. As the months progressed, while there was communication between professionals and the couple, direct social work home visits to Leiland-James were largely limited to the required visiting frequency. And I want to add here another thing about the first foster carers holding Leiland-James most of the time. We need to remember here that for the first 7 months of his life, Leiland-James was with those foster carers. He was a baby, so of course that Leiland-James couldn't walk, so I can see why he was being held a lot. I mean, when my children were babies, I feel like they were in my arms just about all the time. Leiland-James didn't seem to be settling as would be hoped, and there was evidence that Laura and Scott were struggling to bond with him and love him, as they stated that they wished to do. However, there was also evidence of him as a sociable little boy who was babbling, smiling, clapping and laughing. He made good eye contact with both of them and appeared to have a positive and developing relationship with the older child. This was pointed out to the couple along with other encouraging signs that were noted by those involved. At the time, the professional focus included the relational aspects of care, as the worries were about whether the placement could meet Leiland-James's emotional needs and whether the carers, with support from the therapeutic worker, could connect with him enough to give him a safe, positive and loving home for the rest of his childhood. A social worker from the children's team visited the placement on 4th of November 2020 as a mandatory visit to a child looked after, and met with Leiland-James and Laura Castle. The social worker, who didn't meet the family before, said that Laura Castle had shared she was struggling and was worried that she didn't love Leiland-James as she expected to. Her mood was described as flat. The social worker told the review that she had no concerns for Leiland-James's care on the day, but did recognize that support was going to be required. The social worker ensured that Laura Castle had emotional support from her network over the next few days and suggested she speak to both social workers involved. She was reassured that the carer remained child-focused despite her concerns. She came across as open, honest and straightforward. Leiland-James was reported to be showing signs of good attachment at this early stage in the placement and was appropriately snuggling into his prospective mother's embrace. There is no evidence that Scott was alerted to the concerns or spoken to by social services. This visit was not recorded at the time, but only after Leiland-James's death. In this case, this was the first visit to Leiland-James and the carers by the child social work team since the first week after placement. When a meeting was held in December, it was discussed if Laura and Scott wanted Leiland-James to be removed from their care, and they were clear they did not want this. However, it was noted that the family were looking forward to Christmas and Leiland-James's first birthday. It was the plan to work intensively with the family to see if the therapeutic service could have a positive impact and improve the outcome of the placement. There were concerns about how the couple were managing with caring for Leiland-James, although not to the degree that it was of concern for his short or medium-term well-being. Due to teething at the time of the move, Leiland-James was crying a lot, and his social worker stated that he had a particularly high-pitched cry. He liked to be held and screamed if the carers left the room. He had settled to a degree by mid-November, but the early issues likely had an impact on the placement. Scott worked night shifts and slept during the day. The social worker was aware of some tensions in the family. Laura Castle stated that she found it hard to be so scrutinized by professionals and described her relationship with Leiland-James as like babysitting rather than parenting. This was not shared at the time. There was also a degree of child blaming in Laura and Scott's language, with Leiland-James being described as clingy and resistant to affection. I don't even know what that means. What does it mean, resistant to affection? I don't think I've ever heard of this one before. Oh, well, in very extreme cases where usually you have some kind of disorder happening there, but resistant to affection, what does it even mean? It means that she was trying to hold Leiland-James, but he started shouting and he started pushing himself because he didn't want to be held? Or what does that even mean? In November 2020, Laura Castle spoke to her GP about her arthritis as she was struggling with some basic tasks such as opening jars due to pain in her hands and feet. There is no indication that there was a discussion about how this could impact on her ability to care for the baby, or that the information was shared with other professionals by Laura Castle or by the GP. Leiland-James was described as a heavy baby and he wanted to be carried a lot. This may have been painful or at least uncomfortable for Laura Castle, who did most of the childcare. The first meeting between the adopters and the therapeutic service was held on 16th of December 2020. They agreed that the carers appeared to be negative about Leiland-James and found it hard to show any joy about parenting him during the meeting. They were described as tense and flat. It was concluded that work was required and that while they should join a therapeutic group starting in February, they would require support from all involved prior to that. The social worker spent time with the family that day and recorded afterwards that while there were issues, there were also positive interactions observed and indicators that Leiland-James appeared more settled. The social worker who was present noted that Leiland-James was well cared for physically, that he engaged happily in peekaboo, and that he appeared to be meeting his developmental milestones. His warm and positive relationship with the older child was also noted. It was of concern at the time that Laura Castle stated during the meeting in December 2020 that she wanted a break and required relief from Leiland-James. It appears this was in response to the challenge, when information was shared that Leiland-James had stayed overnight with family members against advice. Leiland-James was only seen once more by a professional on 23rd of December 2020 when he attended the GP surgery with Scott Castle for routine immunizations which were undertaken by the practice nurse. Leiland-James was 7 months old when he was placed with the prospective adopters. The family also struggled with isolation during lockdown. At the time that Leiland-James was placed in August 2020, things were less restricted and there was a feeling that life was getting back to normal. The further lockdown in November 2020 and news that a further lockdown may be implemented in early January 2021 would have had more of an impact. The family was still adjusting to having a new baby, it was winter, and the potential need for the older child to be homeschooled from January may have had an impact. This was likely to be an issue for both Leiland-James and the older child in the family. Laura and Scott told the adoption social worker that they missed having regular visitors to the home and going out as a family. They liked to eat out and have day trips, but this was impossible at the time. Leiland-James himself needed to adapt from being in a home with a lot of people to living with a small family, with a father who slept during the day due to night shifts and limited or no visitors due to the new lockdown restrictions. Leiland-James died while being cared for by a couple who had been successfully assessed and were being supported by professionals and their own network. And I only wanted to take you through the whole process of adoption because I wanted you to see all of the things involved around it, and also all of the opportunities that social services gave to Laura and Scott Castle, although I highly disagree with that. And don't you feel like social services just gave them too many opportunities to try and fix something which clearly was not working? I mean, in the end, the adoption assessment was negative, but they kept on giving them support in a way or another. As I was reading this review during my research, I kept on thinking, just take him away from them. How much more do you want to do when it's clear it wasn't the right home for Leiland-James? By the way, guys, I honestly really love this name, Leiland-James Micheal Corkill. It's an amazing name. These children, they have brilliant names. I really love them. Before Leiland-James was placed in her care, Laura Castle had agreed to Cumbria County Council's zero tolerance approach to corporal punishment. But during her trial for the murder in May this year, it emerged she had constantly beaten and abused the baby. In court, she was described as self-centered, abusive and violent. She filmed the baby in distress.
You're all right. What's to do? Stop. You're getting all hot. Olivia. You're getting all hot. You're all right. You're all right. You're all right. Johnny.
In text messages, she bragged to her husband how she had leathered him and described him as the devil's spawn. In one text, she wrote, quote, "I honestly really don't like him lately. He's an absolute moaning whingebag and I totally regret doing this. Although I need to stop smacking him because if I start, I'll not stop at one point and it's not getting us anywhere and then I feel bad." End of quote. Laura Castle stuck to her story that Leiland-James fell until the day the jury was sworn in April this year for her trial at Preston Crown Court when she pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Her new version of events was that she had shaken Leiland-James after he didn't stop crying at breakfast and his head hit the armrest of the sofa before he fell off her knee onto the floor, later saying that she just wanted justice for her boy. After Laura and Scott Castle were arrested, detectives found derogatory text messages on their mobile phones in which they called Leiland-James names and discussed hitting him. Laura Castle wrote that he was a proper knobhead. bag and top fat, while her husband said he was a baby, fat, fit and toss bag. But in court, Laura Castle claimed the messages reflected, check this out, reflected her sense of humor and should not be taken literally, while her husband said that he was now ashamed of them and didn't mean malice, but was trying to sympathize with his wife. Now, I have a question for you, Laura Castle. If you say that this is your sense of humor, I wonder, did you call your biological daughter the same derogatory names as you did Leiland-James? Because if that's your sense of humor, that means that you would call everybody that, because that's just for laughs, right? In the text messages, Laura Castle also said on several occasions that she leathered Leiland-James, although she told the jury that only meant smacking. In one exchange in September 2020, she wrote, quote, "I'm seriously at my wit's end. No one tells you about all this shit. I'm just an abusive parent, so it seems." Scott Castle responded, quote, "You're not an abusive parent, baby. Not at all. Don't say that. I think he's a little too up for us to handle. Let's just call it quits. I don't want you to have a mental breakdown. You're more important to me than him." End of quote. Disgusting behavior. I'm gonna say disgusting behavior. I think that any child, regardless of them being blood related or not, should be more important than an adult, but I guess this is just my opinion. Prosecutor Michael Brady, Queen's Counsel, said it was the Crown's case that she killed Leiland-James as she lost her temper and suggested she smashed the back of his head against a piece of furniture. She denied intending to kill Leiland-James or seriously harm him, but jurors took just 2.5 hours to convict her of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 18 years on May 18, 2022. She was also convicted of child cruelty against Leiland-James. Scott Castle, oh my god, I can't believe I'm saying this, but Scott Castle was found not guilty of allowing Leiland-James' death. He was also cleared of child cruelty. He said he never had any concerns that anything bad was going to happen with the boy, and he trusted his wife. He told the court that on the morning of the fatal attack, he was in bed asleep after working a night shift. I am going to say right now that considering Scott read all those messages from his wife and she didn't hide telling him what she is doing to Leiland-James, don't you think that it's more than likely that when Scott was at home he witnessed the abuse on Leiland-James as well? That's the way I see it. Laura Castle told the court that she found parenting tough and draining. What a surprise there. And struggled to cope with the baby's crying while her husband Scott worked nights. I don't know what she was expecting, because parenting is not supposed to be just a breeze. There will be, things that, and at times you will feel like you are fed up and you are tired and everything, but that's what raising a child really means. So I don't know what was she expecting, only rainbow and unicorns and everything to be pink. What's wrong with some people? She was not able to take Leiland-James to baby groups or soft play due to the COVID lockdown, and she said she didn't have as much family support as she felt she needed. But then I'm thinking to myself, once you have a child, and even when you adopt a child and you decide to take that step and to adopt that child, I think that you shouldn't have to think that you need to rely on your family support. I mean, if you are doing it, you're doing it because you have the best intentions to adopt a child and to help them grow and become adults without you, looking for support from other family, from the extended family. Does it make sense? Do you get what I mean? Because me, for example, if I have a child, even if it's, if it's my own child and I am pregnant and I'm giving birth and I have the child, I'm not already expecting my extended family to support me with raising the child. Do you get what I mean? Does it make sense? In text messages to her husband, she called the baby a top and spoke of leathering him. She admitted smacking Leiland-James's bottom, but she said leathering was just a figure of speech and insisted she never hit him hard. But they all say that, don't they? She told the court that Leiland-James was a big baby who wanted to be carried and cried a lot. She knew that Leiland-James was a big baby when she decided to foster him and to future adopt him, so she knew that from the beginning. She even admitted in court putting earplugs in and watching him on the baby monitor when she struggled to console him. In other words, she left him screaming and shouting when maybe he was probably teething because of the pain, and she was watching him from another room. Yet she was the one struggling because she couldn't listen to his painful cries. Right. It makes total sense. But on January the 6th, 2021, Laura Castle said she shook Leiland-James after he coughed up Weetabix she had given him for breakfast. Okay. I don't know, why would you shake him after he already coughed up the Weetabix she gave him for breakfast? Why would she decide that it's very good to shake him? What was the purpose of that shaking? Because he coughed up Weetabix? Again. Oh my god. You know, these cases, they are seriously just driving me insane. She said that another family member was calling for her help and Leiland-James was screaming. So I am to assume that the other family member asking for her help would have been her daughter, because according to them, Scott was upstairs sleeping, so it was only them in the house, so I assumed that it could only have been her biological daughter. She said, quote, "I shook my beautiful boy. I just wanted him to stop crying," end of quote. David McClellan, Queen's Counsel defending, asked her how hard she shook Leiland-James, to which she replied, "I don't know, hard." She said Leiland-James's head banged on the arm of the sofa, and as she stood up to go to the other family member, Leiland-James fell to the floor. She said she couldn't stand the crying. Quote, "In minutes, I realized what had happened and I thought he was winded. I picked him up and his hands were, oh God, like stiff, and he went floppy and he was like gasping, and I just thought he was winded. I put the bottle in his mouth to comfort him and he was dribbling out," end of quote. When asked what was going through her mind, she said, "Please stop crying, please stop crying, I can't take it, I just wanted it to stop, he was screaming." Laura Castle admitted she didn't tell her husband, the police or doctors that she had shaken Leiland-James, as she was terrified and ashamed. However, she told the court Leiland-James died because of her. Penny Hindle, the social worker, also gave evidence in court, and she said that on January the 7th, 2021, she learned that Leiland-James was on life support at Alder Hey Children's Hospital, and Laura Castle's account of Leiland-James falling off a sofa was being questioned. She phoned Laura to discuss switching off Leiland-James's life support, and during the call, Laura told Penny she had previously attacked or slapped Leiland-James. Quote, "I was really shocked. Given the emphasis on not hurting, assaulting, smacking, and disciplining children in a physical way, she was saying that that was what she had been doing. Leiland-James was only a baby. He had only just had his first birthday. I was really shocked that she would use force with a child," end of quote. Speaking from the witness box at Preston Crown Court, Scott Castle said he believed his wife was overtired and venting in text messages. He insisted any physical punishment to Leiland-James was just a smack on the bum and said he thought they were doing the right thing. Scott admitted they would give Leiland-James a tap on the hand or a smack on the bottom 5 or 6 times a week. In December, Laura Castle texted her husband, who was on a night shift, telling him, quote, "He just had another. I really lost the plot and leathered him. I'm at my wit's end. I'm a midges away from ringing Penny, the social worker, to come and get him," end of quote. Scott replied, quote, "He's becoming a right. I don't like him at the moment either," end of quote. But he told the court he believed his wife was exaggerating. In other messages, she told her husband, quote, "I don't want to be this mom at all. I really hate him. The more he does it, the more I don't want to do this anymore. He makes me so angry," end of quote. Scott told the court he and his wife had discussed returning Leiland-James to his foster carers and said they had decided to give it till after Christmas and New Year to make a decision. However, he said he did not believe they were at crisis point. The prosecution said, quote, "There is sufficient evidence that there was an intent to kill. The degree of force required to inflict the injury and the use of a hard object, namely the coffee table, and the history of cruelty." End of quote. Charlotte Day, the foster carer, said in court, quote, "Leiland-James came into my care only 2 days old, before being placed with adoptive parents Laura and Scott Castle in August 2018. His death has affected all our family. Our children have been offered counseling, and my partner and myself have had counseling. The circumstances of the death affected my personal care and well-being. I constantly look at messages of the time Leiland-James spent with us. Despite my previous happy experiences, I now question whether I should continue my career as a short-term foster carer. I don't know if I could ever trust a prospective adopter again. Attending Crown Court has caused me to feel anxious, scared, and nervous looking over my shoulder. I never told the jury what a beautiful little boy he was with a contagious laugh. I feel I may have let him down. We often visit his graveside and tell him how much he is loved and missed." End of quote. Laura Castle's sentence was referred to the Attorney General's office under the unduly lenient sentence, meaning it could be looked at by the Court of Appeal. But the Attorney General's office has chosen not to refer the sentence to that court, ruling that the sentencing judge did not make an error. It said the criteria for a sentence being unduly lenient was not met. A spokesperson for the Attorney General's office said, quote, "The Solicitor General was shocked and appalled by this case. After careful consideration, the Solicitor General has concluded that this case cannot properly be referred to the Court of Appeal." A referral under the unduly lenient sentence scheme to the Court of Appeal can only be made if a sentence is not just lenient but unduly so, such that the sentencing judge made a gross error or imposed a sentence outside the range of sentences reasonably available in the circumstances of the offense. The threshold is a high one, and the test was not met in this case. End of quote. Laura Corkill describes the woman who killed her son as an evil, sadistic monster. But she is also angry with Cumbria County Council and says it also must bear some responsibility for his death. Quote, "Why did they place him there? Why did it take them so long to pick up on it? They should have cancelled the adoption order." End of quote. A year and a half after Leiland-James's murder, Laura Corkill says no one from the council has visited to her to say sorry or phone to apologize. If he had been allowed to go home with her, he would still be alive today. In the cemetery near Laura Corkill's home, there is a small headstone. The words "gone but never forgotten" are engraved alongside Leiland-James's name and those of his living siblings, the children taken from their mother years ago. Here, Laura says she can be at peace with her child, but it might have been very different. Laura says social workers wanted his body to be cremated and she had to fight to give him a burial. They even tried to write the eulogy, she says. The BBC has seen a draft copy of it sent by a social worker, which includes the words, quote, "Leiland, I'm sorry I was not able to be the parent you needed." End of quote. This is just disgusting. Like, seriously. Laura refused to read it out and wrote her own, quote, "They tried to control me 100%, but it didn't work. They tried to make me forget I was a mother, but no one can take that away from me." End of quote. Cumbria County Council admits he helped Laura to prepare the eulogy, but says she was left to make final decisions. Rebecca Todd from Women Out West says what happened after Leiland's death was unthinkable. Quote, "It all needs to be investigated. Everyone involved with this case needs to be accountable. It's important for Laura. She has been silenced and dismissed. To control a lady that can't even control her own child's funeral where his body is just wrong. It's horrific." End of quote. She says there needs to be a public inquiry outside Cumbria into the decision to remove him from the mother. Laura often sits alone at the grave contemplating what could have been. Leiland-James would be a nursery now. She says it's also the place where no one can control her time with her son. Quote, I've spent more time with Leiland in death than in life. He's home now. I loved him. All I wanted was to be a proper mother. End of quote.
Would have been better off staying with his mum. He would have been still here by now if he went to his mum. They should resign. They don't, so they just carry on, and then ultimately if another kid will be going to the same, another family same thing could happen again. So they should have checked them properly, and that they should have gone into police files and everything back, like they do with those that go right back to the police files. They should go the same with them, even when it's young years ago. So they should really go right back into the past.
And I decided to keep the following to the end. Laura Corkill wrote an emotional letter to the Honourable Mr. Justice Baker, and it says, quote, he was placed in the home of a monster that was meant to love, nurture and cherish him as I would have done. A monster that robbed Leiland-James at only 12 months old of his life, robbed me, his brother, sisters and my family of one day opening the door to the wonderful young man that I know he would have become. People say I'm brave. I am not. I just exist to get justice for my son Leiland-James. Leiland-James was ripped from my loving arms, but I was always his mommy. I carried him within my body for 9 months with every bit of my heart full of love, full of pride, full of promise. My beautiful blue-eyed baby. Love saw his first breath. Evil took his last breath here on earth. Mommy was not ready to say goodbye. I will never be ready to say goodbye. I carry Leiland-James forever in my heart. I hear his cheeky laughter in the wind that blows, see his beautiful smile in my memories ingrained within my soul, his photos on every wall. Even on my worst day, he is my sunshine. My son, Leiland-James, visits in my dreams. He will always be by my side, safe forever now within my heart. No sentence will ever be enough for the pain, trauma and brutality that was inflicted on his tiny baby body and mind. Nothing will ever bring back my baby. Nothing will ever reduce or take away that pain. The monster that scared and broke my baby boy's body and mind will never have forgiveness. This is something that she will carry for the rest of her days. He was not and never will be your baby boy. You lost that right the first second it went through your head to hurt him. He was a precious baby, vulnerable and innocent. He had no voice. He could not defend himself. The names you called him and the hurt you caused him, the fact that you blamed him for your disgusting behavior and treatment of him. Leiland-James was a baby, a tiny baby. Shame, shame on you. You are not a mother. You are a monster. End of quote. And this is the tragic story of Leiland-James Corkill. Okay, so the thing that gets to me the most is how Scott Castle was cleared of everything. Somehow I find it very hard to believe that he didn't know something was going on, and somehow I find it hard to believe that he was sleeping whilst Leiland-James was being killed. I get that he worked night shifts and he was asleep on that morning, but then again, Leiland-James was screaming. He was clearly in pain before he died. His screams wouldn't have been the usual screaming of his. So how did Scott manage to sleep through that? I don't know. I just find it very odd. It's clear from their relationship that Laura Castle was the dominant one, and it seems that Scott Castle, you know, he just kind of went along with it. As for the adoption, I don't think that these people understood fully what it takes to raise a baby, especially if the baby is not your own. I think that they underestimated the work it takes. Their daughter is of school age, so I assume they probably forgot how he was like. And I'm not so sure I believe that they adopted Leiland-James because they wanted another child. This could have been the reason to begin with, but I think that they also saw the financial opportunity. They were in debt, mounting up every month. As foster parents, they would get paid between 200 and 400 pounds a week. So not to mention all the allowances they would receive as well. And let's be honest here, it doesn't cost £200 a week to raise a baby. No way it costs that much. So I really think there was a financial reason here as well, and I think they didn't want to return Leiland-James to the previous foster carers because they were embarrassed. Their family and friends all knew that they had a baby looking to adopt, so it would have been, you know, kind of embarrassing for them to say they can't handle it or they can't handle Leiland-James. But clearly Laura Castle had anger management issues. Couple that with depression, anxiety and alcohol, I am not so sure it's a great combination, in particular the anger management issue and the alcohol combined. And again, I'm going to say that social services just gave them too many opportunities to try and work it out. They should have taken Leiland-James away because there was no bonding there. Laura Castle said she was struggling. She said she didn't love him, but she won't give him back because the extended family love him. So I think for her, it was more to save faces. And another thing which I find quite ridiculous, and honestly it should be kind of common sense, if you are someone who is trying to adopt, will you really tell them all the negative things you do or have, such as mental health problems, anger management problems, financial problems and so on, when you know that clearly if you say this you will not be accepted to adopt? I know that some people will be entirely honest, but others they won't, and they know how to hide things so it doesn't affect them. And it's just ridiculous to me that the assessment is so much based and relied on self-reporting. Also, another thing, if you have a wonderful relationship with your parents, will your parents really speak negatively about you to the social workers? Some do, yes, I agree, but mostly I think that parents usually side with their kids. Also, if you as a kid had corporal punishments inflicted on you by your parents, would your parents really tell social workers you are doing it to your child as well? Leiland-James should have stayed with his biological mother, but it seems that social services were more concerned about her past DV, where, let's highlight this, she was a victim herself. She asked for help. She changed everything. She had positive parents assessment, but social services decided to, what really? Not to treat her as a victim herself? Is it not unfair that she was a victim, yet she worked on herself, stayed away from her abuser, is still going to therapy, and she's being treated as if she's the abuser? I'm wondering here, what is the time limit for a victim of DV to completely change their life and do everything right and get the children back? Because it seems to me that if you were at one point a victim of DV, you lost your children and you lose them forever? Is that how it works? If it really works this way, something is completely wrong with the system, because often children are sent to live with the abuser, the same abuser that the other parent was trying to get away from, and the same abuser that the children were taken from the other parent. So it kind of doesn't make sense that you take the children from the victim of DV and you give the same children to the abuser of the victim of DV from where you took the children from in the first place. Doesn't make any sense, does it? Anyway guys, thank you so much for watching today's video. Please do let me know what do you think in the comment section down below. Take care, stay safe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!